going from Second Temple period, from the return from exile, and we've been making our way through to, well, where we are right now. And I'm just going to share my screen. And we're going to do our best, as always, to go as far as we can based on hopefully what we're able to do. And if you just bear with me for one moment, and we're going to go like this, and like this, and like this. Okay. So we are now starting our third session now. And you can see I kind of titled it From E to Z, with all of those E's that go over there, of course, with Zionism at the very end. So our goal is going to be to go from where we ended last time and to see if we can get as far as Zionism. And we'll see how far, if we do get to Zionism, how far we go. But again, we're going to overlap, and whatever we don't manage to do this time, we'll manage to do next time. Now, as we go through our session together, I'll do one of two things, and I'll see what the flow is like. Either I'll stop about midway, and I'll see if there's any questions, and Rabbi Boxman is there, and she can monitor the chat room, or whatever it's called, if there's any questions, and I'll check in, and she'll then read the questions. Or we can wait until the end, and then we'll, of course, add to any questions that weren't answered. But as we begin to move forward, and we know that we ended the end of our session last week with 1492. We, of course, know what happens with Columbus. But we also know that the expulsion from Spain was something that was going to be a transitional moment in the annals of the history of the Jewish people. Now, the numbers themselves of how many people were exiled from Spain, well, it's not entirely clear. There are numbers which estimate 40,000. There's estimates that go up to 100,000. We know that today there are about 150,000 Israelis or Jews around the world, but specifically Israelis, who have registered with Spain and with Portugal as descendants of that exile, because they're able to get Spanish and Portuguese passports. So that moment, on the one hand, could have been the end. On the other hand, it wasn't anything that we weren't already used to. Unfortunately, we know that Jews have already been on the go. And we know this from our sessions last time. And I mentioned that as the Roman army went west, even before it became Christian, before the Byzantine Empire, Jews were pushing the envelope to get as far out west on the fringes of the Roman Empire, out of sight, out of mind. And what you see on the map here is you can start to see with all the arrows of where Jews are going in the aftermath of the expulsion. But it should be very clear that there are Jews already on the European continent, and the places that they're going is not just in Europe, but as you can see the arrows, they're also going to Morocco, and we're going to have a very rich tradition of Sephardic Jews who are in North Africa. We know that there's Jews who are going to be making their way to the land of Israel, and we'll be talking about that shortly, but also spreading out throughout Europe. And as we can see, as these names pop up on the screen, you can see that we're really making our way everywhere. Now, there are already Jews there, and we'll talk about the significance of that, of the Jewish connection as far as our own survival mechanisms, because as we will be a pariah in most countries that are ruled by the Christian church, not to mention Islam, although we always had it better under Islam than we did under Christianity, that connection of Jews around this part of the world was going to be coming very handy. Now, in the aftermath of the expulsion, there were lots of questions that were going to be asked by us Jews, because when we were exiled in 1492, officially we were supposed to leave by the end of July, although that was extended by a few days. August 2nd, the last Jews are supposed to be out of the country. By the way, there were about 200,000 Jews leading up to that expulsion who chose Christianity, at least outwardly. And that's a completely different conversation. But the questions that we're asking ourselves fall within the realm of, we've been here before. When we were exiled from the first temple, and the first temple was destroyed and we were exiled to Babylon, we ultimately get to Babylon and we say, God, we get it, we were wrong, we made mistakes, we bowed down to foreign idols, please forgive us. Then when the second temple was destroyed, well, we got it as well. And the rabbis taught us very clearly that the destruction of the second temple had nothing to do with the Romans and everything to do with us, and something called causeless hate. And here we are, 1492, after 500 years, 600 years of living in Spain, after a golden age under Islam, and then a semi-golden age under Christianity after the Reconquista in the 13th century. We find ourselves doing everything we thought we were supposed to do. We were involved in the society around us. We had great houses of study and prayer. We had great rabbis and philosophers and writers. And yet, it seems that something is going wrong, because here we are again. So this can really only mean that it's the labor pains of the birth of the Messiah. And with that in mind, we find ourselves going in different directions. And the different directions we're going to go in, and you can remember the map I showed earlier, is we're going to find ourselves, if we look at the photo that the image that you have there behind the graded fence there, that is in Krakow, Poland. And that is the grave of Rabbi Moshe Isserlis. Now, I put this particular photo because Isserlis is an identifier, a pillar of the height to which Jews of Central Europe would reach. Now, we're going to backtrack in just a moment and talk about other moments, and to remind ourselves that this isn't the only time that we find great thought and thinking going on in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and ultimately in what we will identify as Ashkenaz, but also Sephardic Jews. So those Jews who are leaving from Spain are making their way, not necessarily to the land of Israel, but they're going to make their way to great centers that will become even greater centers, one of which is going to be in Greece. And in fact, the strongest Jewish community in the world after the expulsion from Spain will ultimately be in Saloniki. And we see this happening, but we also know that because the labor pains of the coming of the Messiah, we make our way towards the land of Israel. Because if this is indeed going to be the birth of the Messiah, and we know it's going to be bad before it gets better, I want front row seats. I want box seats to the coming of the Messiah. And I put on 4 names of 4 cities. These are the 4 holy cities in the land of Israel: Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and of course the city of Tzfat. Now, let's just see here. We will be talking about Tzfat in just a moment, because it is going to be in Tzfat at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century that Jewish mysticism is not going to be invented. Meaning, Jewish mysticism was already part of what we did and how we connected, and that spirituality that one might tap into when they study Kabbalah was already part and parcel who we are. However, as you can see here on the screen, Kabbalah is going to find a platform on which to really become much more prominent, because in this particular case, I've chosen a picture of the 10 sfirot, the 10 attributes or emanations, as they're called, which provide the Jewish people a frame through which we can better understand how the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof, which in English means the everlasting or eternity or without end, which is a name given to that entity that we call God. God always was, God always is, and God always will be. Now, this particular, how does the Ein Sof reveal God's self within this frame, which we won't get into because it can take a lifetime just to understand the beginnings of Kabbalah, not because you can't intellectually absorb it. I can't intellectually share it because I just don't know. However, Kabbalah, which means to receive, is perfectly fitted at a time when, one, we're trying to find answers. We want to receive answers. We don't know what we're doing wrong. We need to know how to live in this world. But we're also waiting for that physical entity that many of us see as an embodiment of God, God's self, the Messiah's arrival. Now, the Zohar means the illumination. And this text, which also was not written in the 15th and then the 16th century, but rather written by a guy by the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who had an acronym for his name, Rashbi, when he hid out in a cave during the Great Revolt back 500 years before the events of Tzfat. And he hid in a cave for 12 years, and God revealed all the secrets of Judaism, and ultimately these were written down into this book, The Illumination. Now, between you and me and anyone else who happens to be listening in on the Zoom call, it probably wasn't Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but this guy in Spain by the name of Rabbi Moshe de Leon, who in 1300 writes this book, but accredits it to Rashbi to give it the validity it needed in order to really serve a purpose. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is we begin to see this Kabbalah provide an answer for us. Now, the individuals that I have on your screen right now, the Ari, Isaac Luria, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who everyone also knew by the acronym of the Ari, which means the lion, but also is an acronym of his name, Adonenu Rabbeinu Yitzchak, our master, our teacher, Isaac, and Rabbi Joseph Caro and Rabbi Moshe Cordovera will be key components in ultimately the Jewish people's understanding, not only of what Kabbalah is, but how it can be utilized. For example, the Ari, let me just keep going here. The Ari, Isaac Luria, perhaps the most prominent of the Kabbalists of his day, would really not invent this idea, but really be a proponent of the notion that we should not be sitting back and putting our feet up and waiting for the Messiah to show up, but we have to be active participants and to change ourselves even slightly, so that perhaps if we can look at ourselves, improve ourselves, change ourselves, we have the ability to change those around us, and in fact change the world around us. Rabbi Joseph Caro was going to be one who said, you know what, before you dabble in that metaphysical plane, you better know this world. And he gives for us a textbook of how to know this world. And he gives us a book that ultimately would be called the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table. Now, of the three individuals here, he's the only one who's actually born in Spain and on his own self feels this expulsion, as he's only about 4 or 5 years old when we're kicked out of Spain. But writing the Shulchan Aruch, which was a 4-volume series of how to live a Jewish life, he knew that we had to make Judaism mobile because you never knew when you're going to have to run. And Cordovera understood that if you're looking for answers, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, you have to look at what you've been looking at every single day, whether that's the text in the books you're studying or at yourself in the mirror, and just shift your gaze, because the secrets oftentimes are right there. If you think about it, the space between the letters, and not just the letters, are in fact where the essence of your questions could be lying. Other rabbis before me for sure, and educators before me for sure, spoke about this notion, if there's any musicians amongst us right now who understand the power in the pause in your music, in between strumming or the notes where you take a breath, because there's real power there. Now you see at the bottom of the screen, Lecha Dodi, because it was during this time in Spain that we know that Shlomo Alkabetz, another Kabbalist of his day, will be, and a poet to boot, will write a poem that ultimately, on the one hand, seems to be welcoming in the Sabbath bride, but was in fact an incantation almost to help speed up the coming of the Messiah. And ultimately, no matter who you spoke to of these three and those who were a part of their understanding of life, we have to be a part of the solution. The way we do that, among other things, is by making this world better, by taking the shatteredness of the vessel that held the holiness that was God, that was shattered when God created the world for humanity, because God filled all space before, during, and after. When the world was created, something had to give. And that shattered vessel with holiness is what we're responsible to collect and to fix And I'm sure that you know this term already, but tikkun olam is this notion that we have to be a part of the repair. Now, as we move forward, we know that we have to pause. In order to move forward, we have to take a step back. Now, as I'm speaking, and I know I'm using the slideshow a little bit more this time, and there's some more reading, but it's okay because you don't have to listen to everything I say, and I put a lot of things on the screen so that you can, in fact, have a more robust understanding of this period. One step, two steps forward, one step back. Now we're going back to Poland. Now, if you remember those days of the Romans, when the Romans are making their way westward and we're following, Rome is still pagan, then it goes Christian, then we're advancing as we're moving further towards the west and to the north, and then finding different places to settle. You know also that, well, things were always bad for the Jews, depending on who was ruling, because the church begins to impose already from the 5th century. We have synods which are going to mandate rules and regulations of how Jews are to live within the different communities. This particular individual that we have over here, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, is actually coming from Spain. He's a Jew living during that golden age. But the reason we use him as a marker is because, and this is going to be especially true when we study the Holocaust, which we won't really be getting into in our journey together. But when we talk about the Holocaust and what was going on in Poland, it's important to understand that we can't only talk about the Holocaust if we want to understand Polish Jewry, because there is 1,000 years of Jewish history in Poland. Now, in a moment, we're going to get rid of this red arrow, and we can start to get a sense of the role that Poland plays in the story of the Jewish people. Now, I mentioned already Moshe Isserles. I think I mentioned it, maybe not. But Moshe Isserles, who really is, also had an acronym for his name, and you really weren't anyone if you didn't have some kind of acronym for your name in Jewish history. The Ramah, the Ramu, depending on your enunciation, is going to be in the 16th century that pillar which identifies the height of Jewish life in Poland. Now, I mention that because today, when you are out and about and you see Jews who you can identify as Jews because of the clothing that they're wearing, and the clothing that they're wearing is in fact the black clothing with the peot and with the beard, and maybe stockings and maybe not, and maybe a sash and maybe not, and maybe a particular head covering and maybe not, their garb is a reflection of a heyday in Jewish existence, where we were so free and had the ability to create in such great endeavors that we want to hold on to that until, in fact, the Messiah shows up. Now, as we make our way through this we're looking at this particular list of dates, you can see that the 16th century, not only with the Isserles, by the way, I mentioned before the Shulchan Aruch, written by Caro, which in English means the set table, because we know that when you sit down to a set table, all you have to do is eat. It's right there for you. So as far as Caro was concerned, all you have to do is open the books and learn. It's right there for you. As Caro was about to put his this incredible piece of literature on the market, Moshe Isserles was coming up on his final edit of a book that he was writing. Now, as they kind of figure out that, wait a second, he's a little bit late and behind the times, he realizes that, in fact, that what Caro wrote, not just the Shulchan Aruch, but some other books as well, the focus is on Sephardic Jewry, Jews who hail from Spain, and his book, his Mona Lisa, is in fact focused on, has many things pertaining to Jews who come from Ashkenaz, from that ethnicity of Jewish life. And therefore he calls his piece the tablecloth, or the mapa, which can then sit very nicely on top of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, as we go through and we realize that the Va'ad Arba Ha'artzot that you can see here, which literally means the Council of the Four Lands, was a time when Jews, in fact, are rising up. And while we don't own the land, the princes and the kings that were living in Poland, and they look around at the people's, the countries around them, they see how Jews have been good to them. You know what? Let's bring the Jews in and give them a little bit of freedom. Now, as you can imagine, being a middleman between the peasants and the landowners doesn't always make you so ingratiated amongst the common folk. And in this particular case, the gentry was Polish Catholic, and the common folk, or the farmers or the peasants, were Ukrainian Eastern Orthodox. And this is going to bring to a head a revolution, a rebellion that will be led by a guy by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And this will be of the worst disasters the Jewish people have ever faced. While again, the numbers are not clear, whether it's 50,000 who were murdered in these attacks or 100,000, we know that at least 1 million were affected in some way because of these terrible attacks. This is going to begin a downward spiral. And the sense that, well, before the Messiah comes, things have to get worse, is going to create, well, false messiahs. Not the first time, but it is going to be someone who is going to rise up and say, follow me. And this is a guy by the name of Shabtai Tzvi. Ultimately, he will prove to be a false messiah. And when told by the Ottoman Turks, you can either convert to Islam or we kill you, he accepted Islam. Till today, there are groups who still follow Shabtaism. They call themselves the Dorme. But this was a moment. There were people with their bags packed thinking, this is it. This must be the Messiah. And of course, the complete rip within Jewish community, those who believed and those who didn't, was devastating. It was so devastating that something had to happen. And there will be a transition in how we practice our Judaism. This isn't the different streams of Judaism, but there is a sense that's going to be driven home by an individual by the name of Israel, of the good name, Israel of the good name, the Baal Shem Tov, Baal Shem Tov. And he, at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, will be the individual in the southern part of Poland who will go in the Carpathian Mountains, who will move Judaism forward out of the perils, the depth of its despair in the aftermath of both the Khmelnytsky massacre and also the false Messiah, who, by the way, will have copycat false messiahs follow him as well, a guy by the name of Jacob Frank. But Yisrael ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, is going to infuse into Judaism a spirituality that had been lacking. Now, he's not going to say, you know what, if you don't want to do the 3 days of prayer and you don't want to wake up early to go ahead and do shacharit in the morning, don't worry about it. He would say, however, that if you find yourself so enthralled by the beauty that God has created and you miss exactly the time for shacharit in the morning, you'll do it another time. Clearly, I'm simplifying. But this notion of chassidut, a chassid is someone who is devout. And in fact, the idea being, of course, devout to the true spirit of Judaism. But chassidut will begot dynasties, in fact, of different rebbes, different rabbis who go beyond this notion of rabbi. And their followers will, in fact, be devout to them. And some might say that today, chassidut has kind of spiraled out of where it originally was. But this notion of the spirituality is going to be so powerful that it will ignite almost another, not almost, it was a civil war. A civil war in the sense, not with guns blaring, but in Lithuania, there's going to be someone who will be known as the Gaon of Vilna, the genius of Vilna. And born a little bit after the Baal Shem Tov, he will come to an understanding that it is, in fact, that spirituality that brought our disaster upon us. It was that rejection, as far as the Gaon of Vilna thought we were doing with Hasidut, the rejection of our sacred texts, of the Talmud, that brought on the likes of Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank and all the disasters that are befalling us. And in fact, the Gaon of Vilna would point to the Hasidim and say, they're not Jewish. Our children will not marry them. We will not eat together. That's kind of where we were. So this reality of the 17th century is going, and the 16th into the 17th century, we'll see this shift in dynamics within our own existence in Poland. And of course, Poland and the Commonwealth in Lithuania, at one point, those boundaries are united into one country. And then we go to another country. Now, again, we're not continuously, perpetually moving forward. We're taking steps back. And as you can see, this map of Germany, as we have it today with the boundaries around it, we know that there was a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery that was discovered in the 1930s or 40s in Cologne that was a Jewish cemetery. So from the 4th century already, we know Jews were there. Now, as we kind of make our way through a little bit of the history of the Jews in the area, because Germany wasn't really a unified country as we know it today. That didn't happen until the 19th century. But it was a conglomerate of different groups coming together. We know that from 800 or so with Charlemagne, that there would be a more unified Germany. However, it would also be with that we begin to see the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when that happens, this will be key because there will be an eruption of that Holy Roman Empire against the emperor for sure, and also against other Christians. I say that because, and we already spoke about the Crusades last time, but this is important to understand because we are living within this milieu as this is all going down in the 9th century and the 10th century. In fact, up until when the Crusades begin, you know what? Things aren't too bad for the Jews. That we find ourselves able, if not living in the cities, on the outskirts of the cities, but we do reach great prominence as well. Now, once the Crusades begin, however, as you can see, well, things begin to go downhill. And it's not just the mass murders that are happening during the Crusades. In the aftermath of the Crusades, the sacred place that the Jews held within the communities amongst which they were living, which was as merchants, because while they did work the land, they had the ability, because they couldn't own the land and they couldn't own slaves and they couldn't do lots of things because of the mandates within the Christian church, and they had the connections around the Jewish world, and they were never a threat to any of the ruling powers in any of the countries. They were the go-to people in order to be able to become merchants. However, when the Crusades are over, Europeans now, whether they were from France or from Germany or from England, have gotten a taste for the wide world, already have open lanes of commerce, and they don't need the Jews anymore. So in fact, things are going to get worse for Jews in Central Europe, in Germany, after the Crusades. And this will lead to the accusations that I think I alluded to last time as well. When we talk about, in the 12th century, for example, the blood libels that are introduced, these are when Jews are accused of killing Christian babies in order to take their blood for matzah. We know of the desecration of the host, in which Jews are going to be accused of stealing the wafer, the sacrament, and stabbing it as though killing Jesus another time. And of course, the accusation that Jews are responsible for the Black Plague and the well poisoning. So all of this is going to incite more and more riots. And in fact, the fact that Jews from the 13th century and onward would find themselves officially in ghettos. Now, that's not the first time that Jews were forced to live in a particular place, but it's around the 1400s, begin to hear that word ghetto, which actually comes from Venice. Giotto means weapons foundry, and that's where the Jews were corralled, and anybody who was in Venice may remember going to that part of the ghetto. But we oftentimes lock ourselves in for our own protection. Now, finding ourselves as the property of the particular monarch, and we oftentimes did, whether it was in Poland or in Germany or other countries for that matter in these Middle Ages, when we begin to see the world around us change, it generally is not good for us. And in particular, and you can see at the bottom of the page here, with the 16th century, you probably read already because I've been talking a lot, the Reformation and Martin Luther. And we know that in the beginning, Martin Luther is going to go ahead and say, Jews, listen, we're for you. We're all against the Catholics. Who are they to tell us how to live our lives? How about you become part of us? And when the Jews reject Luther, well, we know what happens, and he turns on a dime, and he will be of the most violent rhetoric and action against Jews that we've seen up until that point. And you know what? That's saying a lot. Now, if you're looking at the screen right now, you can see these two columns, because we are moving ahead rather quickly if we think of Jewish history, where in one session we're going 500 years. But it's important to slow down for a moment and look at these 2 centuries. The 17th century will be key as Jews begin to recognize we are of the world around us. Now, we already mentioned the false messiahs. We already spoke about the massacres. And then we have this notion of court Jews. Why are court Jews going to be key as far as understanding the next steps that are going to happen in the 18th century come the 19th century? The court Jew is usually the wealthy Jew, the one who was most wealthy and therefore had more rights and was able to leave the ghetto a little bit more freely. In fact, many times the court Jew, or the Stadtland, as we say, would have been the one who helped finance the prince, finance the king, and would bring information back to his Jewish community, and oftentimes would be able to even protect his Jewish community because of his relationship with the king. But this would be really that first step out of the ghetto into the world that is out there. Because at this point, there is no Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. There is just Jewish. Maybe you're more practicing, less practicing, but you were a Jew. And this court Jew was one who had one foot in the Jewish world and one foot in the outside of that world. Now, this is in the 17th century. Come into the 1700s, into the 18th century, and we have a lot of things happening. In particular, we see that there's going to be a shift of Jews who are moving towards France. We see that there's going to be revolutions going on different continents. Of course, 1776, which will inspire what happens in 1789. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Everyone now will be enfranchised in 1789, July 14th, Bastille Day, except of course for the Jews. Although 2 years later in 1791, French will say, okay, Jews, you can also be emancipated. You can be enfranchised. You can now be equal, which was groundbreaking if you think about it. And that emancipation to become part of the Enlightenment was just around the corner, which is why the 18th century is, in fact, hold on a second, so important to focus in on. What we're looking at now is going to be key in understanding how did Jews go from the ghetto to where we were in the 19th century. And while the individual that you see here, Moses Mendelssohn, was not the founder of Enlightenment, or in Hebrew, the word for enlightenment is haskalah. Haskalah comes from the word sechel. Sechel is your mind. So enlightenment, I get the idea with the light of shining, etc. But in Hebrew, haskalah, enlightenment. Moses Mendelssohn, a traditional Jew, to use a term that won't yet be a term in the 18th century, an Orthodox Jew, but you understand what I mean. By the way, the other photo there is a photo of his grave in Berlin. Moses Mendelssohn will move to uh, uh, the big city in Germany, and he will say, if we're going to save Jews, we have to allow Jews to become of the world around them. We should not forget our Judaism by any means. We should not forget who we are by any means. But we should learn German. We should be able to interact with society around us. And in fact, a quote which is associated with Moses Mendelssohn, be a Jew in your home and a German in the street. Now, he feels as that if people can see his own success and finding that ability to walk in both worlds, then that would be an inspiration. And in fact, the translation of the Bible into German that was done by Moses Mendelssohn will open up Germany and the world to Jews who never had any access, but they knew the Bible and therefore they were able to learn the German. But the language was going to be key. Now, I'm gonna pause for a moment, and actually maybe I'll come back and stop sharing the screen for a moment so that we can look at each other. But this idea of going from Mendelssohn, from the court Jew, to these questions of emancipation and freedoms that we're feeling in France, for example, in the aftermath of the revolution, and ultimately having Mendelssohn as that powerful wind in the sail, doesn't mean it's going to be smooth sailing. Because in 1806, we know that Napoleon is going to turn to the Jews of France and say, well, we know what we told you a few years back, but you can still be free Frenchmen. However, you have to choose whether you're going to be Frenchman or Jewish. You can't be both. So you have to choose. And in 1806, there was something called the Paris Sanhedrin, or Napoleon's Sanhedrin. If you remember, Sanhedrin was the name, the traditional name of that body of leadership back that was outlawed by the Byzantine Romans in 425 to the Common Era. But this Paris Sanhedrin was a series of questions posed to the Jews of France, and ultimately the goal being that the Jews had to choose, am I first French or am I first Jewish? And for the first time, the notion of peoplehood, at least as far as the French Jews were concerned, was pushed to the wayside. And for the first time, the notion of the land of Israel as being that messianic land to which we will always strive to be was pushed to the wayside. Because these Jews came to the realization that we are going to be Frenchmen of Mosaic persuasion. Now, this is groundbreaking, because from here, well, it was a downward spiral to, well, disappearing altogether. Now, I have all these readings, but we won't get into it right now, but you should know that of the 6 children that Mendelssohn had, 2 remained Jewish, and of his 10 grandchildren, 9, I believe that's the number, grew up or were raised as Christians. So whether or not this was ultimately Mendelssohn's intention, it seems as if either he was ahead of his times, or those who came after him, at least in the immediate aftermath, weren't able to find that balance that Mendelssohn had hoped for. Now, as I come back to this shared screen, and I'm almost done here, and then I'll open it up to questions for sure. Okay. Now, what you can see here in the 19th century, whoops, I didn't mean to do that just yet. It's when I think I can get more fancy too quickly. There we go. So what you're looking at here in the 19th century, there's a certain pattern that we can follow. Now, the Jew and the court Jew, of course, that's from a previous centuries, but you know how we got there. But ultimately, all of those steps that happened leading up to it are going to provide for us. And this is only a skeleton overview of the Jewish society in the 19th century, and as you can see, in Western Europe. But this assimilated Jew, or classical reform, conservative, neo-Orthodox, or modern Orthodox, or ultra-Orthodox, are all going to be born in this 19th century. Now, the assimilated Jew, some might say an acculturated Jew, these are the Jews who, well, ultimately would disappear in France because there wasn't enough of an anchor. And this is, for example, Felix Mendelssohn, one of Moses Mendelssohn's grandchildren, a credible composer, but not Jewish as far as his life was concerned. Now, what we see here with the classical reform, unidentified classical reform started by Abraham Geiger at the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, is that that's to differentiate where the reform movement is today. But in its earliest days, classical reform Judaism said all those things, this notion of a messianic era in which we have to aspire to go to that holy land. We have a holy land. We're living in it now because we're free now in the 19th century, whether it's in Germany or it's in England or it's in France. And therefore, we don't need the land of Israel. And peoplehood, you know what? I am French. I am German. That's my people. My religion, going to be Jewish. And I'm going to adapt that Judaism because I don't necessarily believe that there is that divine revelation that happens at Sinai. And therefore, there isn't eternal truth. And therefore, I want to focus on what I think is the foundation of my Jewish identity. And that is going to be ethical monotheism. This classical reform, as you can imagine, is going to find its way juxtaposed to those who would rise up and say, whoa, you have disregarded your Judaism, and therefore we have to, in fact, put up walls in order to protect us even more. And that is going to be what we would today identify as ultra-Orthodoxy. The conservative and neo-Orthodox or modern Orthodox were attempts to try and find some kind of balance. Conservative Judaism understands the need to adapt and to identify that Jewish life is in fact continuously evolving. There, in fact, was that divine interpretation of the Torah, if not divine revelation of the Torah. Therefore, there is a certain element of that holiness that we can't change, but adaptable for sure. And that modern Orthodoxy, to be simplistic for the moment, would say, you know what, it's not Judaism that needs reforming, it's Jews. So maybe I'll trim my beard and maybe I'll go ahead and wear a modern suit. I'm simplifying, but that kind of gets us to this next screen. And we look at what's going on in Eastern Europe, which is a different experience. We don't have the same emancipations that are going on or revolutions that are going on because, in fact, the czars, Catherine, Alexander, Nicholas, Alexander, we remember. As we in Eastern Europe, in Russia, the Russian Empire, are on the one hand dealing with religious anti-Semitism, as opposed to the political anti-Semitism that was being felt in Western Europe, which we haven't even spoken of yet, we know that there will be attempts by some of the different czars. Some are going to be a little bit more lenient and want to bring the Jews in and kill them with kindness, as it were. You can't go study in your cheder, in your Jewish house of study, but you can go to university, and other czars who said, you know what, you have to enlist in the army from the age of 12 until you are 30. And of course, this would destroy Judaism. So we find ourselves, not to mention, of course, being exiled to certain areas and regulated to living in certain areas. And of course, the pogroms that are going to go on in the 1870s, 1871 and 1882, that in fact would generate enough fuel to propel the Jewish people across the world. While all of this is going on, there is also an enlightenment which is happening amongst Jews of Eastern Europe. And this will be less within the realm of reforming Judaism and more of tapping into and harnessing Jewish culture, in particular, Yiddish culture. One particular pillar is Yud Lamed Peretz, where he is going to go ahead and be I would say, the most powerful proponent of identifying that Yiddish isn't just a translation or tool that we use in the ghetto, but it is a rich language with a rich heritage and culture on par with the classical languages of Europe. I have now up on the screen a bit of a step back, as you can tell, because in a moment, meaning we're going to not start today, we'll start next week, we will be speaking about Zionism. And there's this notion that Zionism begins in the 19th century. In fact, it did begin in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century. However, this love of Zion, this need to be in the land of Israel, Zion being a synonym to the land of Israel and also to Jerusalem, Zionism, a love of the land, did not begin in the midst of the 19th century for the political reasons that it began being influenced by the nationalisms that were developing, whether it was Italy or Romania or Greece or France or Germany. But it begins with the exile when the first temple was destroyed, as you can read here. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Not to mention the golden age of Spain, and we've mentioned him once already, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I may physically be in the West, but my heart is in the East. So this notion of Zionism is going to be a function, on the one hand, of the world in which the Jews are living in the 19th century. It'll be a function of all of the centuries leading up to that 19th century. And it will absolutely be a function of, well, who we are, what's innate inside of us. This 2,000, not to mention 3,000 year-long yearning to be in this land. Thank you. Okay, I can check the chat box here for a moment. Let's see.
I don't think I see any unless you got any direct questions to you.
Oh, no, but say hi to Felicia Rubin, whose daughter, yeah, Melissa Johnson, yes. I don't know who to, but,
hi, yes, happy to say, send your regards, absolutely.
Yes, thank you. Oh,
they're wild about you.
Wonderful. Okay, so once again, I know some of you have taken me up on it, have sent me some questions over the past week. It could be that, well, there was in fact a lot of information. It's a little bit overwhelming. I did send a timeline that hopefully is a bit of a frame for you. But as that information begins to settle, if you have any questions, I'm here. I'm happy to answer and to continue the conversation. Rabbi, anything else?
I think that's it. If I know most of the members of my congregation did receive the timeline. If you did not receive it, feel free to email me or Rabbi Boxman the Senior, and either one of us can forward that to you. And also the recordings for Temple Shalom, the recordings of each of these sessions is posted on our Facebook page and also on the YouTube channel. So if you need to go back and watch those, that's where you'll find them. And for Kol Tikva, I'm not quite sure where those are being posted, but they are being shared. So Dad, are you able to unmute? Let's see.
So maybe I'll take one more moment, Rabbi Boxman, and to say,
absolutely, if
we want to try and grapple with this amount of information, because if this is your first time, even if it's not your first time, this is really quite overwhelming. I have to tell you, even if you've done this a lot, it's overwhelming. But to think about this, kind of, if you think about the trajectory of the Jewish people, it was never a straight shot. Meaning, and even as we discussed, we went up through the 1500s, then we went back to around 900. Then we went forward and we came back to about 1,000. Then we kept going forward and we find ourselves like spokes of a bicycle going out, because we in fact did spread out. I've only touched on briefly, although we'll do it more next time, about the Jews who are living in Arabia, meaning within Arab lands and under Islam. And of course, we know that in the middle of the 17th century, Jews are going to be getting on boats and making the first Jews arrive in the middle of the 17th century in North America, in the United States. What becomes the United States becomes America. So we know that we spread out, and forget about all the facts and figures. If we can recognize that there is an ebb and flow of Jewish history, the facts, they'll fall into place. But it's important to understand that in order to better understand what happens now in the next 150 years, I think it's important that we did what we did. And over the next 2 sessions, where there's lots of information, of course, but it's clearly much less time and more condensed, I think we'll have a better grounding in understanding as we shift gears and focus on what's happening in the land of Israel, that is Palestine, as it was called before 1948, and of course the state of Israel. Having all that information under our belt gives us more of that foundation. And I will point out, you are my first guinea pigs on me upping my game on my PowerPoint. So hopefully it looked better this time than it did last time, and it will only improve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ori. This was a great session. We look forward to seeing everybody again next Monday.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Ori, very much. It was very,
Bye.
very interesting. Very interesting.
Great. Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Well done.
Yuri, thank you.
Thank you.